The sky over Alaska was a dull gray canvas that morning, heavy with clouds that looked ready to burst. The small Cessna 208 had left anchorage just after dawn, slicing through the icy wind with only 4 souls on board. Among them was Ethan Cole, a 34-year-old engineer heading to a remote job site deep in the wilderness. He had flown this route before, but something in the air that day felt different. A silent weight pressing against the cabin windows, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Within hours, that quiet unease would turn into a nightmare he would never escape. At 11:42 a.m., the radio went silent. The plane had hit a violent downdraft, its right wing catching an unseen gust that twisted the aircraft like a paper toy. Panic flooded the cabin, the sound of tearing metal, the sharp sting of fuel in the air, the scream of engines giving up. Ethan barely had time to grab his seatbelt tighter before the world turned upside down. Then came the impact, bone-shaking, brutal, and final. Snow exploded around the wreck like a white bomb. When it settled, there was only one sound, the wind whispering across a field of broken metal. He woke up hours later, half buried in snow, surrounded by silence that felt alive. The fuselage lay torn open beside him, jagged and smoking. 3 others, gone. The reality hit like a hammer. He was the only one left. His breath came in clouds, his hands shaking as he pulled himself free. His leg throbbed, his right arm was bleeding. But pain meant life, and life was all he had now. He looked around, endless white, mountains like ghosts in the distance, and realized no one was coming soon. For a long time, he just sat there staring at the wreckage. He thought about how fragile everything was, how a routine flight could vanish from the world in a single violent moment. His phone was dead. The emergency beacon had snapped in half. The nearest town was over 100 miles away. He was alone in one of the harshest places on Earth, with daylight fading fast. And hunger, that cruel, primal whisper, had already begun to speak. By the second night, his mind started to unravel. Cold gnawed at him like a living thing. He rationed the few granola bars he found, melted snow in a tin cup, and prayed for rescue that didn't come. Then came the moment every survivor dreads, when instinct silences morality. On the 4th day, desperation forced his hand. The wilderness offered nothing but death, and death was not yet ready to take him. Ethan Cole, a man who once lived behind a desk, now faced the most human choice of all: to do what he had to, or die. Before we dive deeper into Ethan Cole's story, his fight against the Alaskan cold, hunger, and the unspeakable choices he faced, take a moment to subscribe to Edge of Survival. Each week, we bring you real and inspired stories of ordinary people pushed beyond their limits. Stories that prove what the human spirit can endure when everything is stripped away. Like, share, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, because survival stories belong to all of us, no matter where we live. Now, let's return to the man who found himself alone in a frozen graveyard, fighting the impossible. Ethan Cole had never imagined himself a survivor. He wasn't a soldier, nor an adventurer. He was a systems engineer, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who planned his days down to the minute. But when the plane hit the ground, the world no longer cared about plans or logic. Every rule he'd ever lived by became meaningless. Survival, he would learn, was not about strength. It was about surrender. Surrender to pain, to hunger, to the raw and unforgiving rhythm of nature. And as the days blurred together, he began to realize that his fight wasn't just against the elements. It was against the part of himself that still refused to believe he could live through this. In the frozen silence of the Alaskan wilderness, time lost all shape. The sun rose and fell behind walls of ice and fog, marking days that felt identical, a loop of cold, pain, and waiting. Ethan built a small shelter from twisted metal and seat cushions, his hands bleeding from the cold. Every night he spoke to the darkness, whispering the names of those who hadn't survived, as if their spirits could hear him. The loneliness was worse than the hunger. It was a weight pressing on his chest, heavier than the snow itself. By the 5th day, food was gone. He scavenged what he could, melted snow for water, bark, tiny patches of moss. The human body, stripped of comfort, turns into something primal, guided by instincts long buried under civilization. Ethan began to think differently. Every noise became a threat, every shadow a sign. His world had shrunk to a few square meters of snow and wreckage, and yet, within that prison, his will to live grew louder. The crash had taken everything familiar from him: warmth, safety, the company of other voices. But it also gave him something rare: absolute clarity. For the first time in his life, Ethan saw the truth about survival. It wasn't about conquering nature. It was about coexisting with it, bending without breaking, adapting without surrendering hope. As the snow kept falling, he made a vow to himself that no matter what he had to do, no matter what the world thought of him afterward, he would not die there. Not in that frozen place. Not like this. When Ethan finally regained full consciousness, daylight was fading into a deep, icy blue. The silence around him was absolute. The kind of silence that hums in your ears, pressing from all directions. His body ached in places he couldn't name. A thin mist rose from the snow where the plane's wreck still smoldered, and the sharp smell of burned metal filled the air. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply stared, trying to remember who he was, where he had been going, and why the world now looked like a graveyard. Then, as the memories rushed back, the screaming, the tearing metal, the fall, his breathing quickened. He was alive. Somehow. Impossibly. Alive. He tried calling out, his voice hoarse and broken. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" The sound vanished into the wind. He crawled toward the fuselage, dragging his injured leg through the snow. Inside, twisted seats and shattered glass reflected the dim light like broken mirrors. 3 passengers, 2 men and a woman, lay still, their bodies lifeless and pale. Ethan froze, the reality sinking in. He was alone. Completely, terribly alone. The kind of aloneness that crushes your chest and steals the air from your lungs. Instinct took over. He searched the wreckage for supplies, moving with slow, trembling hands. A few granola bars, a water bottle half full, a lighter that barely sparked. He found a torn blanket tangled under a seat and pulled it free. It smelled of fuel, but warmth was warmth. He wrapped it around his shoulders and stumbled back outside. The temperature had already dropped below freezing. In the fading light, snowflakes drifted lazily from the clouds, landing softly on the wreckage like a burial shroud. Night fell fast. Too fast. He knew he needed shelter before the cold swallowed him whole. Using what remained of the plane's fuselage, he built a crude lean-to, lining it with seat cushions and shredded insulation. It wasn't much, but it blocked the wind. His hands had lost almost all feeling. Every breath burned. When he finally collapsed inside, the pain came all at once, sharp, electric, alive. He bit down on his sleeve to keep from screaming. That was when he realized that survival wouldn't be about strength. It would be about endurance. He forced himself to eat half a granola bar, chewing slowly as if it were gold. The sweetness coated his dry mouth, offering a brief illusion of comfort. He melted snow in the bottle's cap with the lighter flame, sipping it one drop at a time. Then, wrapped in his thin, fuel-soaked blanket, he closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to escape. Every sound outside, the shifting wind, the creak of metal, became an enemy. He thought about his family, his parents in Oregon, the fiancé waiting for him back home. Would they even know what happened? Would anyone? Sometime after midnight, the wind changed. It howled through the wreckage like a living thing, carrying voices that weren't there. He sat up, his heart pounding, certain he'd heard footsteps crunching in the snow. He whispered into the darkness, "Hello." No answer. Only the sound of the storm building again, stronger, angrier. The shelter trembled, and for a second he thought it would collapse. But it held. He pressed his back against the cold metal and waited, every nerve in his body screaming. Hours passed in fragments. At times he drifted into shallow dreams, flashes of the crash, the faces of the others, and then jolted awake, shivering uncontrollably. His watch had stopped at 11:42 a.m., the moment of impact. Time no longer mattered here. He tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat. It wasn't faith he needed now, it was focus. He began repeating a single thought over and over like a mantra. Stay awake, stay alive. By dawn, his body had grown stiff and unresponsive. When he tried to move his fingers, they barely answered. He crawled out of the shelter, blinking against the white glare of morning. The world stretched endlessly around him, a desert of snow and silence. Steam rose faintly from the wreck, the last sign of warmth fading away. He looked to the sky, searching for movement, a plane, a bird, anything. Nothing. Just blue and white and the echo of his own breath. The hunger started as a whisper in his stomach, then grew into a dull ache that gnawed at his insides. He tried to ignore it, telling himself rescue would come soon. But deep down, he already knew. No one was coming today. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. He needed a plan. He needed fire, food, and something to keep his mind from breaking apart. He had survived the crash, yes. But surviving the days that followed, that would be the real test. That night, as darkness fell once again, Ethan realized something profound. The world he once knew, the one of clocks, comfort, and safety, no longer existed. Here, in this frozen expanse, only one rule remained: adapt or die. He stared into the flames of his fragile fire, the light flickering across his face, and whispered to himself, "I'm still here." It wasn't a cry of triumph. It was a promise. The first of many he would have to make before the wilderness decided whether to let him live. By the fourth day, hunger had stopped being a discomfort. It had become a rhythm. Ethan could feel it pulsing beneath his ribs, hollow and deep, like the beating of a second heart. The granola bars were gone. The water bottle was empty. He melted snow, but it did little to satisfy the gnawing ache that twisted his stomach. His head felt light, his vision blurry at the edges. He had begun to move slower, to think slower. It wasn't just the cold stealing his energy now. It was his own body turning against him. He searched the wreckage again, desperate for anything edible. In the corner of the torn fuselage, he found a small emergency kit. Inside were bandages, a flare gun, 2 signal flares, and a single vacuum-sealed packet of peanuts, the kind handed out on flights without a second thought. He tore it open with trembling hands, counted the peanuts one by one, 13, and ate half, saving the rest for the next day. The taste felt like a miracle, salty and real, a reminder of a world that now seemed impossibly far away. That night, the wind returned with vengeance. It screamed through the valley, lifting waves of snow that buried half the wreck again. Ethan lay awake, wrapped in his blanket, staring at the thin roof of his shelter. His thoughts grew darker, heavier. He thought of warmth, of food sizzling in a pan, of a table set for dinner, and then, inevitably, of the bodies still inside the fuselage. He shook the thought away violently, disgusted with himself. But once the idea entered, it wouldn't leave. It lingered like a shadow. The fifth morning brought no rescue, no sound of engines above, only the wind and the steady fall of snow. His face was cracked from the cold. His lips bled when he spoke. He had to force his body to move. Each step felt like dragging a stone uphill. He gathered scraps of insulation and plastic to patch the shelter, then spent hours trying to light a fire. The lighter's flame barely held, sputtering against the wind. But finally, it caught. The tiny orange glow felt like a heartbeat in the frozen world, fragile but alive. Ethan sat close to the flame, hands stretched out, palms burning. For the first time since the crash, he felt something close to safety. He melted snow in a tin can he'd salvaged and drank slowly, letting the warmth spread through his chest. He thought about his family, his mother's voice, his fiancée's laugh, and the guilt hit him like a wave. He was alive, and they were probably mourning him already. He wanted to scream that he was still here, but the wilderness doesn't care for words. It only answers with silence. By the 6th day, Ethan's body began to fail. His muscles cramped, his hands shook uncontrollably. He scavenged for anything that could be eaten: pine needles, bark, moss. He found nothing. Every sound began to echo louder, every shadow stretched longer. Hunger wasn't just in his stomach anymore. It was in his thoughts, his dreams. When he closed his eyes, he saw food. When he opened them, he saw snow. The line between the two started to blur. At midday, he stumbled upon something half buried under the wreckage, a small dead bird, frozen stiff, maybe killed during the crash. The sight made his heart race. He picked it up, his fingers numb, his mind screaming 2 words: "Don't do it." He sat in the snow for nearly an hour, staring at it. His civilized mind and his starving body argued like 2 strangers. In the end, instinct won. He brought it near the fire, plucked what feathers he could, and held it over the flames. The smell was awful, acrid and bitter, but it was food. He chewed the flesh slowly, each bite feeling like both salvation and surrender. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, staring into the darkness, waiting for guilt to crush him, but it didn't. The human mind, when stripped of comfort, adapts faster than reason allows. He realized then that survival wasn't noble or clean. It was raw, brutal, and selfish. And for the first time, he accepted it. The Ethan Cole who boarded that plane had died in the crash. The one sitting in the snow now was someone else entirely, someone capable of anything. The following day brought clearer skies. For the first time, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the snow with a harsh golden light. Ethan took it as a sign. He searched for anything else the wilderness might offer. Near the tree line, he found traces of small animals, footprints frozen in place, and beneath a rock, a patch of green moss. It tasted bitter, but it was something. Every bite meant another hour of life, and in a place like this, an hour was everything. As night fell again, Ethan sat near his weak fire, staring into the flickering light. His reflection danced in the metal fragment before him, hollow eyes, cracked lips, a beard beginning to form. He barely recognized himself, yet in that broken face there was something fierce, something alive. He whispered into the night, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm not done yet." The forest listened in silence. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled, and Ethan Cole, the man who had once lived by logic and order, whispered back, "Neither am I." By the 9th day, Ethan's world had shrunk to a narrow circle. The shelter, the wreck, the fire that never seemed to last. Everything outside that radius felt like another planet. His body was deteriorating fast. His joints ached, his skin hung loose, his thoughts moved like smoke. When he stood, the horizon tilted. When he breathed, his ribs ached like they might splinter. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was simply delaying the end. That morning, the temperature dropped again. The sky had turned to steel, and the cold seemed to come from inside his bones. He'd stopped feeling hunger in the normal sense. It was now more like pain than appetite. A deep, stabbing emptiness that made his hands tremble uncontrollably. His last trace of food, the remaining peanuts, was gone. He licked the inside of the empty packet just to taste something. He could hear the wind whisper through the fuselage like voices, sometimes his name, sometimes laughter. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. He thought again about the bodies. They were still there, covered in snow, frozen, silent. He'd been careful not to look at them too long. But the idea had been there since the 4th day, festering in the back of his mind like a wound that wouldn't close. He tried to pray instead. His lips cracked as he whispered, "Lord, help me, please. Show me what to do." But the only answer was the groaning of the trees, the creaking of the broken metal. In the wilderness, God's voice was sometimes just the wind. Quiet, indifferent, distant. By evening, delirium began to creep in. Ethan saw movement at the edge of the trees, a figure walking toward him, steady and calm. For a heartbeat, hope flooded his chest. Rescue. He stood, waving, shouting, stumbling toward it. But when he blinked, it was gone. Only snow and shadow remained. He fell to his knees, sobbing, the sound muffled by the storm. It wasn't until later, sitting by the weak flame, that he realized he had been calling out his father's name. A man who had died years ago. Night came early and cruel. The cold was unbearable now, biting through the last layers of his clothes. He crawled inside the wreckage, the fire flickering low, his breath fogging the air. He looked at the bodies again, 3 of them, twisted where they'd fallen. Their faces were gone, unrecognizable under frost. He tried to remember their names. He couldn't. They were just shapes now, reminders of what he used to be. The thought that had haunted him for days returned stronger than ever. It's either them or you. He fought it. At first, he screamed, he prayed, he begged the silence to give him another way. But starvation is louder than morality. The fire of reason dies slowly, replaced by something ancient, something raw. He remembered reading about men who survived the Andes crash, about sailors adrift who had done the unthinkable. He had always judged them, safely seated behind the comfort of a full stomach. Now he understood. Now the word choice had lost its meaning. When he finally moved, it wasn't out of madness or evil, it was out of instinct. His hands shook violently as he approached the nearest body. He whispered, "I'm sorry," again and again, as though the words could make it less real. The cold had preserved everything. He used a piece of metal to cut, his face blank, his eyes distant. He didn't think. He couldn't. His mind had become a blank space filled only by survival. When it was done, he sat outside the wreck, staring at the mountains, numb to everything but the sound of his own heartbeat. The first bite was both agony and relief. His body rebelled, he gagged, he wept, but his hands didn't stop. The warmth that followed wasn't just physical. It was something darker, deeper. The pain in his stomach eased, replaced by shame that burned hotter than the fire ever had. He wanted to undo it, to wake up from it, but there was no dream to wake from. When the tears came, they came like a flood, shaking him until his throat was raw. He whispered again, "Forgive me, God. Please forgive me." That night he didn't sleep. He stared at the stars through a crack in the wreckage, cold, brilliant, and infinite. He thought about the world beyond these mountains. People eating dinner, children laughing, someone turning on a lamp in a warm house. And him, somewhere out here, a man unrecognizable even to himself. But as the hours passed, something inside him hardened. Not in cruelty, but in endurance. He realized survival wasn't about holding on to who you were. It was about becoming who you had to be. When dawn came, it was quiet. Too quiet. The wind had stopped, and the sky had cleared. Ethan stepped outside the wreck and looked toward the horizon. The mountains seemed closer now, the air clearer, the light almost golden. He felt an unfamiliar strength in his legs, his senses sharpened. He had crossed a line he could never return from, but he was alive. The guilt would come later. It always does. For now, he whispered to himself, 14 days. Just make it 14. Then he turned toward the sun, walking into the frozen wilderness with the face of a man who had nothing left to lose. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the wind itself. The world around Ethan seemed frozen in time, every branch coated in white, every breath a ghost that vanished before his eyes. He walked slowly through the snow, leaving deep footprints behind him, each one a small act of defiance against the endless cold. His body was weaker now, but his will, strange as it sounded, felt stronger. Something had shifted. He wasn't walking just to live anymore. He was walking to mean something again. He found himself speaking aloud to no one. Sometimes to the mountains, sometimes to the dead, sometimes to himself. The sound of his voice was almost comforting, proof that he still existed. "You're not done yet," he muttered through cracked lips. "You hear me? You're not done." The words echoed faintly across the valley, bouncing off walls of ice and stone. For a moment, he imagined an answer coming back, a whisper caught on the wind. Maybe it was the sound of snow sliding from a branch. Maybe it was something else. By the 11th day, hallucinations had become his companions. He saw light flickering between the trees, like lanterns moving in the dark. He followed it once, thinking it was a rescue team. But the glow came from the northern lights, distant ribbons of green and violet dancing across the night sky. He stood there, breathless, staring at the heavens. It was so beautiful it hurt. In that moment he laughed for the first time in days, a rough, broken laugh that sounded like a sob. Even in the middle of nowhere, beauty still existed. That realization stung more than the cold. Later, as he sat by a fire he'd barely managed to start, Ethan whispered, "If anyone's listening, I get it now." His voice trembled. "I wasn't grateful. I thought strength meant control. I thought survival meant never breaking. But you can't walk through hell and come out clean, can you?" The flames snapped quietly, as if answering him. He stared into them for hours, lost between guilt and grace. Somewhere deep inside he felt a faint warmth that didn't come from the fire. A presence, or maybe just the memory of one. On the 12th morning, he awoke to the distant roar of an avalanche. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, shaking the ground beneath him. He jumped to his feet, instinct taking over. Snow fell from the trees, clouds of ice rising like smoke. It wasn't close enough to reach him, not yet, but it reminded him just how small he was in this place. He shouted into the emptiness, "You'll have to do better than that." His voice cracked, half defiance, half madness. For a heartbeat he felt alive again. As the day went on, he began to follow a frozen river, hoping it might lead to lower ground. And maybe, eventually, to people. His hands were bleeding from the cold, his lips blackened, but he pressed on. The river curved through narrow cliffs, where the sound of his steps echoed endlessly. At one point, he thought he heard another set of footsteps, light, quick, following his. He turned fast, knife in hand, heart pounding. Nothing. Only snow falling gently like the world was trying to bury the noise of his fear. That night, he dreamed again. Vivid, almost real. He was back home, sitting at a wooden table with his mother. She was pouring coffee, smiling softly. "You always rush," she said. "Always afraid to be still." He tried to answer, but his throat wouldn't work. Then her expression changed, her eyes suddenly serious. "When you wake up," she whispered, "listen, you'll know what to do." He gasped awake, the dream fading like smoke. But the words remained. "Listen." The next morning he didn't move right away. He just sat there, listening. Not to the wind, not to the cold, but to the rhythm of the world itself. Somewhere far off, a faint sound echoed, a low, mechanical hum. At first he thought it was his imagination, but then it grew louder. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't the storm. It was an engine. He staggered to his feet, heart hammering. He climbed a nearby ridge, eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was blinding off the snow, but then, there, a small plane circling far in the distance. He waved his arms, shouting until his voice broke, lighting the last flare he had. The red smoke rose weakly into the sky, torn apart by wind. The plane didn't seem to notice. It banked once, then turned away. Ethan fell to his knees, watching as the sound faded into nothing. His vision blurred with tears he didn't have the strength to wipe away. He whispered, "No, no, please." But then, as if mocking or blessing him, the sound came again, closer this time. The plane had turned back. The flare must have caught someone's eye. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, hope was louder than silence. When the rescue team finally found him, he couldn't stand. His voice was gone. his eyes hollow. But he smiled, a small, broken, beautiful smile. The rescuers later said they found him kneeling, one hand raised toward the sky. When they asked what kept him alive, he just whispered, "Something told me not to give up." They thought he meant instinct. But Ethan knew better. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't madness. It was the voice in the silence, the whisper that never left him, even in the darkest night. When Ethan opened his eyes again, the world was no longer white. The walls were pale green, the air warm and heavy with disinfectant. He was lying in a hospital bed, wrapped in layers of clean sheets. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him looked unfamiliar, but the light, soft, filtered, human, made him cry. A nurse noticed and smiled. "You're safe now," she said gently. "You're in Anchorage. You're going to be okay." The words barely made sense. Safe. Okay. After so many days of fighting to stay alive, the idea of safety felt unreal, almost offensive. They told him he'd been found near the wreckage, half buried in snow, clutching an empty flare gun. His body temperature had been dangerously low, his pulse fading. The rescue team said they almost missed him, that the red smoke had been the only thing visible against the storm. "Another 10 minutes, the pilot said, and we would have turned back." Ethan nodded weakly, unable to speak. How do you thank someone for 10 minutes? How do you explain that those 10 minutes were the line between life and eternity? Days passed in fragments. He slept, woke, slept again. Doctors came and went. They asked about his injuries, about what he remembered. He told them the basics, the crash, the cold, the hunger, but never the full story. Not the voices, not the fire, and certainly not what he'd done to survive. Those words stayed locked behind his eyes. Whenever someone asked how he managed to stay alive, he just said, "I kept walking." It was true enough, and it was the only truth he could bear to share. When he finally left the hospital, the sun hit him like a shock. The world was louder than he remembered. Cars, voices, laughter. The smell of food made his stomach turn. People stared when they recognized him from the news, the man who survived the crash. They whispered. Some wanted to shake his hand, others just watched, unsure if he was a miracle or a ghost. Ethan didn't feel like either. He felt like someone who had walked too close to something sacred and come back burned. Reporters came next. They asked for interviews, book deals, TV appearances. They wanted the story, the details, the drama, the pain. But how do you describe silence? How do you put hunger and fear into words that people sitting comfortably at home can understand? He refused most requests. When one journalist pressed too hard, asking how he really survived, Ethan just looked at him for a long moment before saying quietly, "Some truths aren't meant for daylight." The reporter didn't ask again. At night, sleep was the hardest part. The hospital lights were gone, replaced by shadows that felt too familiar. He dreamed of snow, endless, suffocating snow, and the sound of wind whispering his name. Sometimes he woke up gasping, hands reaching for a fire that wasn't there. The doctors called it trauma. They said it would fade, but he knew better. The wilderness had left its mark, carved deep into his soul like frostbite that never truly heals. Still, there were moments of peace. One morning, months after the rescue, Ethan went for a walk along a frozen lake. The ice reflected the pale winter sun, and for a brief second, the world was silent again. The same kind of silence that once terrified him, now strangely comforting. He closed his eyes and listened. The wind brushed against his face, soft, almost kind. Somewhere within that silence, he thought he heard it again. That quiet voice that had kept him alive. Not in words this time, but in feeling, a reminder, a promise. He began writing, not for others, but for himself. Pages filled with fragments, sounds, images, pieces of memory he could never say aloud. The crash, the hunger, the faces of those who didn't make it. Writing didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape. It gave him control, and maybe deep down it was his way of making peace with what he'd done. Not forgiveness. He didn't think he deserved that, but understanding. That survival isn't about purity. It's about the courage to face the mirror afterward and still choose to live. Sometimes he visited the families of the other passengers. He didn't tell them everything, only what they needed to hear. That their loved ones hadn't suffered, that he'd tried to save them. Both were lies in a way, but they were lies born from mercy. Each visit took something from him, but it also gave something back. A sense of connection, however fragile. He realized survival didn't end with rescue. It was an everyday decision, to wake up, to breathe, to move forward despite the weight of the past. Years later, when people spoke of him, they still called him the man who survived Alaska. But those who met him knew better. Ethan wasn't just a survivor. He was a man who had seen the edge of humanity and stepped back, trembling but alive. He had faced a choice between dying and doing the unimaginable. And in that frozen wilderness, he had found not just life, but truth. That the line between man and instinct, between despair and hope, is thinner than a breath. And sometimes, the voice that saves you isn't thunder from the heavens. It's the whisper that says, keep going. In the years that followed, Ethan never spoke openly about what truly happened in those frozen days. He lived quietly, far from the noise of cameras and questions, carrying a story no one could ever fully understand. People often looked at him and saw a miracle, a man who had beaten death, a symbol of endurance. But survival, he knew, wasn't triumph. It wasn't glory or strength. It was something quieter, something harder to explain. It was the simple act of choosing to take another breath when every part of you is begging to stop. The wilderness had stripped him bare of fear, of pride, of illusion, until all that was left was truth, and that truth was both cruel and beautiful. That we are capable of far more than we believe, but we never emerge untouched. Sometimes, when winter came and the air carried the same scent of frozen pine, he would find himself staring out into the distance, eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something to return. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the version of himself that had vanished in that crash. He never found it again, not completely. The world had moved on, but part of him remained in Alaska, buried under snow and memory. Yet he didn't resent it. In some strange way, the wilderness had become his teacher. It had taught him that life isn't measured by safety or comfort, but by the moments we decide to keep fighting, even when we no longer know why. Pain had shown him what mattered. Hunger had taught him humility, and loss had given him the kind of clarity that only those who've walked through darkness can ever understand. Ethan once said, to the few who dared ask, that he didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because he was afraid. Fear, he believed, was proof of life. It was the reminder that something inside still wanted to see another dawn. He carried that idea with him until the end, that survival isn't about conquering nature, but making peace with it. It's about learning to listen, to the silence, to your heartbeat, to the voice that tells you to move when reason tells you to stop. Most people will never know that kind of silence, that kind of battle. But if they ever find themselves on the edge, lost, broken and alone, perhaps they'll remember his story. Not for what he ate or what he endured, but for what it meant. That sometimes the difference between life and death is nothing more than the will to whisper, "Not yet."